What we have here is what I think you already know it is. It's a long bone. It's a very stereotypical long bone. It happens to be a femur. I can't tell whether it's right or left upper leg, but it's this one right here. I want to look at a little bit of anatomy on this, how these grow, because obviously a 2-year-old has a much shorter femur than you or I do. Once we deal with growth, I want to talk about remodeling, how it happens through your lifetime, because as I mentioned, these bones are always responding to the stresses that you put on them. So how do they figure that out? And lastly, what happens when you break it? So let's start out with some of the anatomy here. This shaft through the middle is referred to as the diaphysis. And then the two heads over here and here are the epiphyses. So 2 epiphyses, a diaphysis, and what I mentioned earlier is this thing called a growth plate is there. So we have to figure out what this happens to be. Periosteum, of course, this is that osteogenic layer that's going to be producing more bone. And then articular cartilage that's going to allow for a lot of motion and movement. Next video, I want to address some of these articulations. Do the articulations have a lot of movement and motion between, or no motion between? We'll get around to that next video. You can see the compact, see the spongy, but let's get to what's going on in here. At an earlier age than this was taken from, there's a lot of busy stuff on this next slide. But this is all of us at a younger age. There's that articular cartilage that, just to have a throwback, is going to be connected directly with the synovial joint. We'll get around to that next video. What we have here at the end is the epiphyses. Here we have the diaphyses. And essentially what happens is this, to really try and cut to the chase. The osteoblasts in the diaphyses at the ends are going to be producing essentially more bone. And so they're going to be pushing up. Then we get to this little hyaline cartilage that's continuous out here. It's all the way around at a young age. Then, once we're in the epiphyses, what we're doing is we're building more bone as well. And then, of course, this looks kind of weird. I have a weird name called spicules. Ultimately, these are going to be remodeled into either compact bone or spongy bone. Same thing up here. And there I can see all of that spongy, compact, spongy, and compact. So think about what's going on here. We've got this growing and this growing. And what it's doing is it's pushing this epiphyseal plate. It's what we call a growth plate when you're younger. What I mentioned before is, yeah, you're playing out for junior varsity and you break your leg, you break your arm. Quite often, because this is just simply cartilage, it gives way really easily. So you take a shearing hit to a long bone, this is going to be really strong. We've got our collagen, we've got our hydroxyapatite, we've got those weight-bearing columns, but here we just have cartilage. So that's one of the places of least resistance. So as you envision the diaphyses getting longer, and you envision the epiphyses getting larger, what ends up happening is the length is going to grow. By the time you get to my age, or most of our ages, once these two have pushed all the way through, it ends up collapsing that hyaline cartilage, and that cartilage then is turned into more bone. And what we see is now what we call an epiphyseal line. And it's bone. It's all solid osseous tissue. It's no longer cartilage. But take a look at what used to be this entire loop of cartilage that went all the way across the middle. It's still on the outside. because this is where we're going to have the bone articulate with another bone, and it's going to allow for movement, especially in some of the stereotypical long bones. Now, as far as this mentions growth in diameter, because of course your femur has gotten larger around, the diameter has gone up since you were 4, I hope. And what ends up happening there is just essentially bone addition. So what you're doing is you're building more osteons. And so you make it bigger and bigger and bigger, more weight-bearing pillars. And then on the inside, you reabsorb any that you have to, and you'll continue to build this into spongy tissue. I wish they had brought the spongy tissue down just a little bit further on this one. But this is essentially, without getting into a myriad of details, how we end up taking things like long bones and switching them over from cartilage and then growing them into the adult bones that we have. If I didn't mention, typically this completes by about age 18 if you're female, age 21 if you're male. So males will have slightly longer long bones than you will if you're female, which is one of the things that comes into play with this discrepancy when we look at overall height of males versus females. Why are statistically males taller or slower before we get rid of the epiphyseal plate and turn it into a line, or the growth plate and turn it into the line? Now, I mentioned remodeling. What does that mean? Remodeling is rebuilding these things. If all of a sudden you decide you're going to take up powerlifting, or you are going to take up some other physical activity, maybe it's long distance running, you're going to put different pressures on your skeletal system than you were yesterday. So these bones have to be able to respond to that. So how do they do it? It's going to be a dance. It'll be a dance between the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts. How much do I build? How much do I break down? So what hormones do they use? What chemical signaling do they use? And I want to give you 3. PTH, which is parathyroid hormone, calcitonin, which is simply calcitonin. These are both proteins. They've got these nice, cool alpha helices on them. And then there's calcitrol. Calcitrol is a derivative of steroids. If you think all the way back to some of that chemistry we did ages ago, here's a steroid right here. There's just been a bond broken here, some other extensions put off over here. It's not important. I just wanted you to see that when we talk about these things, there actually is, there are molecules. This is what they are. So, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, the 2 biggest players. And it's pretty simple. Calcitonin, when this is secreted into the blood and it's picked up by the cells of the osseous tissue, what calcitonin is going to do is it's going to up-regulate the absorption of calcium and turning it into more bone. So if I have a region that I need more bone in, that's going to be the job of calcitonin, the primary job of calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone, on the other hand, downregulates calcium deposition into the bone. So parathyroid hormone, look at my marker, is going to drop bone calcium levels, calcitonin increase. So you can see that it is a really intricate dance between these 2. If you end up with an increase in calcitonin, you end up with increasing the amount of bone tissue. Conversely, if you increase the amount of parathyroid hormone, now you're going to look at a loss of calcium deposition in the extracellular matrix. A smaller player is calcitonin. Sorry, let me skip. I'm trying to rush again. Is not calcitonin, but is calcitrol. Calcitrol will do a small job, play a small role in increasing. So increasing the deposition of calcium into the osseous tissue. So the two most important, the biggest players in our lives, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Now, something that I always wondered about when I first learned about this process is how does it know where to deposit? Where does it know, or how does it know where to pull it away? Where do I make bone larger? Where do I make bone smaller? And there's something called the piezoelectric effect. Let me see, piezoelectric effect. Now what this tells me is this. That hydroxyapatite that I mentioned in the previous video, apatite crystallizes and it turns literally into crystals. Piezoelectricity is what's generated when you compress a crystal. And so if you happen to be putting a lot more pressure on one part of a bone somewhere in the skeletal system, it's going to create just little microcurrents. Those microcurrents are picked up by the cell, and the cell realizes, hey, we don't need to deposit more over there, we need to deposit more over here. And I have a feeling some of you have experience with the piezoelectric effect. What I mean is this. If any of you happens to have a gas grill that has a little push start on it, you push down on it and snaps, and there's a spark, and now you have a flame. If you've ever experienced one of those, you can also have my camp stoves and things like that. That is the piezoelectric effect. What is in there happens to be a crystal. Can't tell you what it's a crystal of, but when you push down, you're compacting, and then you hit it, fires off a current, that becomes a spark, and your gas grill lights up. That same effect, that same law of physics applies to your bones as well. That's why I think 2 videos ago I mentioned if we end up looking at the skeletal system of a hominid that happens to be 3.2 million years old, we can tell if he or she happened to be a long distance runner, whether he or she didn't do a lot of running, but they just hung out around the cave or wherever they lived at the time, or if they did a lot of upper body work, lower body work, because sure, the muscles have been gone for a long time. So how do we know that if there's no soft tissue? We know it because the bones are remodeled. So remodeling is something that goes on throughout our entire life. And I think you can tell too with parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, if these get out of whack, you can end up with some real problems with your skeletal system. Now, speaking of problems with your skeletal system, fractures. All right, so you break one of your long bones, the base of your thumb. How do you repair it? Well, here's what starts to happen. I went to a doctor who set it and realigned it and put pins in it so it wouldn't keep jiggling around. But once it happens to be set, and of course you don't have to go to a doctor, you could just say, oh man, I don't have insurance, so I can't go to the doctor. I'm just gonna wrap it and let my body do what my body's gonna do. Let's maintain some homeostasis. Here's what's gonna happen first. With the fracture itself, we'll go from left to right on this. We end up forming a hematoma. A hematoma is essentially a fancy word for a bruise. So remember, there's a lot of circulatory system in here, especially through all that dense that dense, real compact bone. Well, when you shear the bone, you shear off the circulatory system. And I want you to focus on something that's kind of important here. We see the hematoma going outside of the bone itself. So it doesn't just stay on the inside, it bleeds out in both directions. When I realized I had broken that thumb bone, I knew right away that this is what was going on. What's going to happen next is we're going to start to develop cartilage in there, and we call it a callus. So it now starts to toughen up. Not real tough, but tougher than the hematoma. And if you look, we have a callus on the outside, or external, and then we also have a callus on the inside. Now what's going to happen next is that this cartilage-based callus is going to go through the same processes that you and I went through in the development of our entire circulatory system, which is simply, let's convert the cartilage over into bone. So what you see over here now, I think they're referencing it, yeah, the bony callus of spongy bone. So now we start to have this nice spongy bone in here, and then that is all going to be remodeled into the appropriate amount of spongy and the appropriate amount of compact bone. And if you take a look, once it's healed, per se, the fracture is fixed, there's a swelling. This is the callus, and that callus forms all the way around, not just on the right and the left, but out towards you and behind into the board. So I would have left you with this particular question. You got this big lumpy callus out here. How are you going to get rid of it? And the answer to that is remodeling. So if your body realizes, wow, I don't need this out here, it's going to absorb it. So we're going to remodel this entire thing. That's another way that we can take a look at organisms in our evolutionary past that maybe they were around 800,000 years ago. And you go, wow, she had quite the fracture in her right femur, or she had a fracture in the skull, or he had this. We're able to rebuild that history, I'm drawing a blank on the word that I'm looking for. Essentially, that history, and be able to rewrite the narrative, that's the word I was looking for, on what life was like 800,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago, doesn't matter. Because these bones fossilize really, really well, they preserve really, really well, and they have the entire narrative of how that individual survived. So we've dealt with repair. We've dealt with how do these bones get longer. We've looked at remodeling. We've looked at the microscopic structures. We've looked at the cellular structures. Now, what I want to do in this next video, I want to shut this down, switch some things up. I want to talk about what are called articulations. In other words, where does one bone intersect with the next bone? And depending on how this femur articulates the pelvis and what's called an acetabulum right here, it's a nice little cup. Does it give a lot of freedom of movement? Not very much freedom of movement. And the last thing I'll mention is this. Get ready for some bizarre words. I'm not making them up. You can look them up in a book. But they were very foreign to me the first time that I learned about them, and they still are, honestly, a little bit foreign to me. So I will have this one up soon as well on YouTube. The last one, which would be I think the fourth one. So for skeletal system, I'll have one of 4 that'll all be about articulations and some very bizarre words. So there you go. With that being said, I'll be right back.